Thank you, Eric. Early this morning over breakfast, I had the pleasure of getting to know our keynote speakers, Governor John McKernan, President of the U.S. Chamber Foundation, and Dr. J.D. Foster, the U.S. Chamber's Deputy Chief Economist. The U.S. Chamber Foundation has released a new report that focuses in on the imperative for more economic growth. At the Florida Chamber Foundation, we understand this imperative, and it plays a vital role in all of our research. And that's why we've developed the Cornerstone 2030 study, which helps us analyze what Florida needs for the future. Governor McKernan said it best, it's pretty simple. We need to get back to our historic economic growth rate. He said that lawmakers must consider the impact on growth in policy discussions, and said Congress should consider reforms to taxes, immigration, entitlement policies to spur growth. This has never been more true and at the forefront of Florida's success. Please let us welcome Governor McKernan and Dr. Foster to Florida, to the Florida Chamber's Board of Governors Capitol Days.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for that overly generous introduction. I would say that it leaves me speechless, but I don't want to get your hopes up because J.D. and I have a few things to say this morning. In fact, when I was governor, I gave a commencement speech, and the young woman who had been in charge of speakers came up to me afterwards, and she said, "Governor, I hope you weren't expecting to be paid for that speech." I knew the answer to that. I said, "Oh, of course not." She said, "That's good. We're trying to save our money so we can get a really good speaker next year." I tell you that because you don't have to wait till next year, because I brought with me a really great speaker, J.D. Foster, who is going to, I think you're going to find very interesting in terms of his insights and the importance of economic growth and how we get that growth so that all of America can prosper. But I want to just start by first of all just telling you something you probably already know, and that is what a fabulous job and how respected Mark Wilson is. Not just for what you and he are doing here in Florida, but for what he does to help with the U.S. Chamber and our efforts to try to get this economy moving again in Washington as well. He's a voice that is listened to, not just about what's happening in Florida and what needs to happen in Florida, but what this country needs in order to get us back on track and have the kind of future that we want. So we appreciate his inviting us to be down here. And then I have to put in a plug for all of you. And I say that because what you're doing is really important, and I tell you that from someone who has been on the receiving end of what you're doing during your Capitol Days. As governor, I always felt that one of the most important days that we had while our legislature was in session was our Capitol Days when the Chamber came to the state capitol. And I know that all of you have a lot to do. You have a lot of pressures on your time, and this is probably just one more thing that a lot of you didn't need, but you did it anyway. And you came here, and it is so important to the future of this state that your voice be heard. You're fortunate in that you have a governor and a legislature that are responsive to the issues that you think are important, but they have to understand what those issues are and how it impacts the people that they serve in order for them to make the right decisions and put in place the right kind of policies. And it's only by your spending the time to give them some of those arguments in person, the face time with legislative leaders and with the governor and people in his administration. It truly does make a difference. And you can frankly already see it in the policies that Florida has, which puts you near the top, if not at the top of the pack, in terms of what you're trying to accomplish to prepare Florida for the future. So I thank you for being willing to be a part of this effort. It truly does make a difference. Well, let me just ask you a question, and that is, this is sort of a time for truth here. How many of you here in the audience, raise your hands, had ever even heard of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation before you heard that I was coming to speak? Not bad, not bad. It's been 2 years now since we've had a foundation. So those hands, there are more hands now than there were a year ago. The foundation, I want to talk a little bit about that because it's important. And I know you have a foundation here. I'm going to meet with the board of your chamber foundation later this afternoon. And it plays such an important role. We had 3 different 501c3 affiliates at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce until January of 2013, and they did really important work in terms of educating the public on the importance of public policy issues that were going to improve our country. But the problem was, A, they were small, B, none of them had the Chamber of Commerce in their title. So when they did things, nobody even knew they were associated with the chamber, and they didn't get the attention they deserved for the good things that they were doing. So Tom Donahue, in his great judgment, this is before my time, so I'm not taking credit for it, realized that we needed to pull all of those activities together under one U.S. Chamber of Commerce foundation. And that is what has now been in place for 2 years. We have 3 different smaller 501c3s that have been brought into that one foundation, and about 8 different programs. And what I wanted to do is just tell you a little bit about the foundation, then I'll get into the topic that I really want to cover, and you'll see how this all ties in. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation is the 501c3 affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And we are dedicated to strengthening long-term American competitiveness and educating the public on how the free enterprise system benefits both society and the economy. Now, I tell you that because competitiveness is what is going to drive increases in our standard of living if we can compete in this global economy. And when we think, and the reason that I'm here is that when we think about competitiveness, we think about that in terms of federal policies. We think of it in terms of state policies, and especially policies on business climate. And we think of it in terms of local policy, oftentimes in terms of regulatory burdens for businesses trying to create jobs. So we in Washington focus on the federal policies and the need to improve those federal policies so that America can compete and businesses in America can thrive and continue to have to provide the kind of economic opportunity for our citizens that a competitive company in a competitive economy can provide. But we also understand that the only way that we're truly going to be competitive is if we have the right policies at the state level. Because if we don't have the right state and local policies, we're not going to be able to take advantage of the potential that could be there with the right federal policies. It has to all work together. That's where the state and local chambers come in and are so important. So what we do at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation is we have a group called the Emerging Issues Group. We look farther down the road. What are the kind of challenges and opportunities that businesses in our country are going to face in terms of our economy farther down the road, and what are the kind of things we can do now to prepare for that, to either address the challenges before they become too serious, or to take advantage of the opportunities that we see coming. And the second aspect is a group called the Enterprising States Group. And we do an annual report. We do an annual report on ranking the states on their business and job creation climates in a number of different areas. And we do that because we think that ultimately the jobs are going to be created at the state and local level, and that's where we have to make sure that we have the right policies. So if you see here, you can see that Florida does well. You know, you're number 2 out of the 50 states in infrastructure. You're number on our scale. You're number 9 out of 50 in terms of talent pipeline. So that shows the wide array of investments that you're making that are going to be so important for future economic activity. You're number 1, as you can see, in higher education efficiency. You're number 2. If you look at the second one, in the new startup rate, which is important, which shows the vibrancy and the growth that is taking place, and number 5 in both the business tax climate and in broadband availability. Again, making sure that you're making that wide array of investments that truly can make a difference. And I'm so impressed with your Cornerstone report and the 6 pillars, because you clearly have identified the different buckets that we have to look at if we're going to be successful in creating the right kind of business climate here in Florida. And I would argue that every state could stand to have those 6 pillars, and including the federal government understanding the importance of the array of investments that we have to make if we're going to be competitive in this 21st century. You're putting in place all the right aspects to start to see your economy here in Florida grow even more. And you will be successful, but you will not maximize your potential if we don't get the overall economy going with the right policies in Washington. So I don't know how many of you sort of follow economic statistics, but the question is whether you understand what the average annual economic growth rate for GDP has been over the last 50 years. And so look at it in 10-year increments. What's the average annual growth rate? 3.3%. And I would say that that rate of growth has produced a pretty remarkable America. If you think about our standard of living and how it's grown, you think about the fact that every generation has sort of been better off than the one before it. And it's because that growth has produced the kind of economic activity that has increased our standard of living and improved our quality of life. Well, about a year ago, I was looking at the Congressional Budget Office, a 10-year economic outlook. And it just sort of struck me when I looked not only at what the budget was going to look like, but more importantly, why it was going to look that way and the implications to the rest of our economy and economic opportunities for our citizens on their conclusion that the average annual economic growth rate for the next 10 years is going to be 2.5%. 2.5% compared to our average for the last 50 of 3.3. So what struck me was what is the impact of this lower growth rate going to be? And I kept trying to look at it, and this is for those of you who are visual learners. It just struck me that this can't be our future. I mean, we cannot have, if you look, most of you too far back to see this, but where most of that blue line is in between the 3% and 4% growth rate. You see a little blip in the late 60s and early 70s when it got up to 4.5 for a while and then back down in between 3 and 4. And that's the way it stayed, except when we had the sort of the clearing out during the early Reagan years of the end of the Carter years, when we had that high inflation and interest rates, and we had that recession that dropped right down. But look how it popped right back up to that historical average. And we still stayed in the 3 to 4% for the next almost 30 years until we get to 2008, and then look what happened, the Great Recession, which we all know about. The problem is, in that downturn, we didn't go back up like we did in 1982 to that 3 to 4% average growth that we've had. And you see we dribbled along, and then we're starting to come back a little bit now, but every estimate and forecast from the Congressional Budget Office and most economists, and JD can talk about this, is that we're going to be in the 2 to 2.5% range. You even had some economists, a lot of them have written on the fact, is 2% the new normal for the United States? Well, you better hope not. I sort of hope not, because it will transform the way we think about opportunity in America. And that's what has to be addressed. And the only way to do that is if we are going to if we're going to make the kind of changes in long-term economic policies that's going to create the long-term growth. Why does 2.5% growth versus 3.3 matter? Well, here's what we have in store. This is the annual deficit. Right now we're down into the 400 to 500 billion in terms of our deficit. Look what's happening by 2024. Back up to $1.1 trillion if we don't change policy in this country. $1.1 trillion in annual deficits at the end of this 10-year period. And what that means is that our national debt, because of all those additional years of more deficits, is going to be $21 trillion. I mean, that's not a future that this country can withstand. It's going to make us like Greece when you look at our debt as a percentage of GDP. So we talked about this at the foundation, and we made the decision that we would retain a fellow named Doug Holtz-Eakin, who was a former director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and a former chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, to do a study for us in terms of what if we just got back to the national average for the last 50 years in terms of economic growth? What would happen if we were at 3.5% growth, as an example, over the next 10 years instead of 2.5%? Because that's not asking for the moon. I mean, that's just saying, let's get back to where this country has always been. So Doug issued this report, The Growth Imperative that David mentioned, and he shows how if we want to maintain our future and the American dream, we need to get our growth rate up. And JD is going to talk about in a little more detail about why that's the case and the kind of policies that would drive long-term economic growth as opposed to short-term cyclical growth, which is nice, but it doesn't get you the kind of long-term growth rate that you're looking for. There are other policies that have to be approved in order to do that as well. Because the difference between 2.5% and 3.5% annual growth takes the deficit from not $1.1 trillion, but takes it down to $400 billion and heading toward balance. That's what just the compounding impact of that increase in our growth rate over 10 years gives us. And when you have those lower deficits, obviously what happens is the debt comes down. And so the debt, as this economy is growing faster than is projected and getting much larger over 10 years, then that means that this lower debt becomes a much more manageable percentage of our GDP than would otherwise be the case, and puts us on the path to the kind of prosperity that we've come to expect in this country, and that we can have if we just have the right policies. So just to try to simplify this, which was the intent of our report, to make this sort of manageable and understandable so that we can explain it to elected officials, because you always need an elevator explanation for people that have a lot of other things on their mind. And so what this means is that for 1 percentage point in additional growth, it is going to mean more jobs in America. It's going to mean higher incomes. It's going to be lower deficits. It's going to mean less debt. And it's going to mean more wealth as a nation. And by wealth as a nation, it's going to mean that parents are going to be able to afford to send their kids to college. They're going to be able to have a second car. They're going to be able to take a vacation they haven't taken since 2008 because of their concern about the economy. It's those kind of everyday things that will transform everyday life in America in 2024 compared to what we're going to see if we don't make these kind of changes. Now, if you look at what we're sort of trying to convey here, you can see that the difference between 2.5% growth and 3% growth at the end of 10 years is 1.2 million more jobs in America. It means on average income of an additional $4,000 per year per capita. If you look at the 3.5% growth, you can see there's 2.5 million additional jobs by 2024. And that's $8,000 a year in an average income. Those are the kind of changes that really transform not only the country, but lives for individuals. And that's why all this matters. Because we really do have an opportunity, if we change the policy, to get us back on track. We don't even need to do better than we've done in the past. We just need to get back on track with what we should expect in America, of the kind of growth that is going to give people the opportunities that they ought to deserve in a country like ours. So before I turn this over to JD, let me just sort of review two slides. This is the one I showed you earlier. 2.5% growth for as far as we can see. That's not the future that we want. What we want is just to get up between those red and green lines, back to our average of the last 50 years in terms of economic growth. And when we do that, all of a sudden we're going to have the kind of economic opportunity in this country that all the good work that you've been doing here in Florida and the business climate that you're putting in place and the attractiveness for job creators is going to blossom and provide all sorts of opportunities for people in Florida, because the overall economy will be growing, companies will be looking to create economic activity, and they're going to look to the states that have made the right investments and prepared for that future growth. And Florida will benefit enormously. And so let me now just, again, thank you again for not only for being here, but for what you're doing during Capital Days, because it's going to allow Florida to continue to be so competitive. Now I'll turn this over to JD, and he can talk about exactly how we're going to get to this promised land. JD, thanks.
Thank you, John.